Hello again, everyone. With all the recent interest from the community in 1 vs. 1s, I figured doing a 1 vs. 1 guide to go alongside my domination guide would be a welcome addition to my video series. Although this guide was created on the last day of Module 21, most of the info in this guide should stay good for a very long time. I will also link the script for this video in the video description, for people looking to verify what their ears heard. Getting into the content now. 1 vs. 1s, also known as duels, are a really valuable tool for helping you improve your fighting prowess and build, no matter how experienced you are. I also recommend new players for most classes start out with 1 vs. 1s before trying to do any 5 vs. 5 matches. However, there are a few classes and roles that will want to get their 1 vs. 1s out of the way quickly and move on to matches, such as Ranger and Healers. Now I will go over some important info about the nature of 1 vs. 1s in this game. 1 vs. 1s are a part of PvP in this game, but have never been catered to as their own separate thing. All of the PvP in this game was designed around team versus team content. One of the consequences of this is that some classes ended up with significantly better 1 vs. 1 capabilities than others. There are additional layers to this, like your build too. Some builds are better able to handle 1 vs. 1s than others. Tanky builds generally handle 1 vs. 1s better than squishy builds do. Classes with strong dailies also tend to do better in 1 vs. 1s if they have significant. Classes with strong dailies also tend to do better in 1 vs. 1s if they have significantly more action points than their opponent does. Another layer to this is counterclass dynamics, which is just another way of saying rock, paper, scissors. Each class has classes they are naturally advantaged against, and classes they have a really hard time against. These advantages and disadvantages aren't spelled out anywhere on your character sheet, but are very much present. As an exception, when a class becomes overpowered, their natural disadvantages versus certain classes can shrink to a barely noticeable point. Changes to the meta in this game can also temporarily strengthen or weaken a class's advantages and disadvantages, resulting in some classes temporarily becoming stronger or weaker versus certain other classes than they normally are. Now, PvP matches are team-based and allow you alternatives to victory besides simply killing your opponent in a 1 vs. 1 more times than they are able to kill you. If you can't kill your opponent 1 vs. 1 inside a match, you could rotate around them, or kill someone else, or get your teammates to help you kill that person, and you will still be able to contribute to the win. If you play healer, you could heal people instead of killing at all, etc. With the above in mind, it becomes apparent that past a certain point in terms of skill, it is next to impossible for the underdog classes at 1 vs. 1ing to win more duels than classes that naturally excel at 1 vs. 1ing. Assuming we are measuring class variables alone, both players are equally skilled, and we have a decently large sample size of duels. You see a similar pattern unfold for certain builds versus other builds. For accurate dueling results that measure skill or counterclass dynamics, you usually want both you and your opponent's builds to be really similar to each other, especially now that the game has been simplified to the point that there isn't much build variety for what is optimal. Because of everything I just mentioned above, the real way to improve at 1 vs. 1s isn't to always kill your opponent more times than they are killing you. That would be an unrealistic, borderline impossible task if that was the goal. So what do you focus on instead if you are trying to get as much out of your 1 versus 1s as possible? Well, that would be achieving the best performance versus each class you possibly can. You might not be able to always win more often than your opponent, but you can still max out your capabilities versus that opponent. There is a crude ratio you start to notice from doing a lot of 1 versus 1s for how often X class is supposed to kill Y class in a 1 versus 1 setting. As a real example, let's say you had a wizard going against a rogue in Mod 21's meta. The wizard will probably kill the rogue at least 3 times for every 1 time the rogue kills the wizard, assuming both are equally skilled and have similar enough builds to each other. If the wizard finds they are dying more often than the rogue is, then that isn't supposed to happen, and there is probably a major gap in skill or build between these two players. These two could practice with each other often, and these two would eventually get to the point where the wizard always kills the rogue more often than the rogue is killing the wizard. The rogue would still improve, since you two went through an arms race of adjusting to each other and getting better and better. That rogue will still get much better at killing all the less experienced wizards, and will also improve at punishing the wizard they practiced with's mistakes. If the rogue class later got buffed enough in future metas and modules to make them overpowered, then they could use their skills to beat up the wizards they used to lose to until the meta changes again. There is another important variable I will go over: broken or OP items. As a general trend, there are several broken and OP items that make the gap between classes much smaller in 1 versus 1s. But there is a catch. The quality of the fights drops to joke status, and how often you win from these items is pretty much a fixed value that is super easy to achieve. Let's say a rogue 1 versus 1's a warlock as another realistic example from Mod 21, and neither opponent was using any of the items on the private match item ban list from PvP Arena Discord. The result of that would likely be each of the fights lasts a long time, around 4 through 6 minutes. But the rogue would still die more than 20 times for every 1 time they kill the warlock. The best case scenario is the rogue kills the warlock around 6 times instead of 1 time. Either this or the rogue builds tanky and simply stalemates the warlock. Thankfully, this isn't much of an issue in matches where you are part of a team. Surviving for 4 through 6 minutes is plenty long enough to be able to do your job properly in a match setting. The rogue would be able to leave or get help long before they actually die. If both opponents decided to put on a 3k magnitude mount, let's say tunnel vision, then the ensuing 1 versus 1 results would be a lot less extreme. The warlock would probably kill the rogue at least 3 times for every 1 time the rogue kills the warlock. This is because tunnel vision is ensuring that there is a near fixed amount of deaths that will happen. The fights will feel pretty silly though, since anytime one of you has a 3k mount ready, the other person dies for next to no effort. But technically, using tunnel vision does make the fights more balanced in 1 versus 1 settings. Technically. As something else to note, a completely optimized, experienced rogue running all of the strongest items would probably turn the tables on Warlock and become a little bit more powerful than the Warlock would be using those same items. It's hard to say for sure for this particular matchup. You could also just use other broken items to make yourself completely immortal. If your opponent did the same, technically this would also be a balanced matchup, but you'd still both be bored out of your skulls. Another important variable for 1 versus 1s is RNG in fights. This includes a lot of things in this game. Some examples are critical hits, deflects, and purposeless actions players make. RNG is something you want to pay close attention to in 1 vs. 1s, so you can see the difference between bad luck and bad gameplay. Experienced players tend to be more and more aware of just how much bullshit and RNG is involved in fights. Becoming aware of RNG in action is both a blessing and a curse. Understanding this helps you play better, but it often discourages experienced players from continuing to play this game. Now, I won't go over every single counterclass dynamic in this video. I'll probably cover that in my upcoming video on DPS subroles in PvP. But to quickly list off what the best 1 vs. 1 classes are in Mod 21, it is Fighter, Wizard, and Warlock. Fighter in particular is basically the king of 1 vs. 1s. The very worst classes at 1 vs. 1s in Mod 21 are Ranger and Rogue. Healer doesn't really get anything out of 1 vs. 1s beyond the introductory practice and build adjustments where they learned how to stay alive versus one enemy, but they can stalemate. Some classes like Paladin are less useful than Ranger and Rogue are, but Paladin is still more likely to stalemate in a 1 vs. 1 than those two classes are. Now, I wouldn't expect any of this to change in Mod 22, but I could be mistaken. Here is a handy tip for winning more 1 vs. 1s. Your focus and emotional state in PvP matters a lot, especially in 1 vs. 1s. If you are in a 1 vs. 1, and there is nobody else on the map besides the two of you, then the only thing your opponent has to pay attention to is you. There aren't any distractions you can lean on to make them easier to fight. You'll need to put more effort into outplaying them and have a stronger will to stay alive. To win more 1 vs. 1s, you want to mentally pull your focus back towards your middle. Think of it like you are guarding your character's core. You also want to pay attention to what your opponent does. Awareness is still important. You don't want to leave yourself open to take unnecessary dangerous hits, and you want to be more confident and aggressive. So putting your focus here helps you avoid a lot of unnecessary deaths. In matches, you are part of a team, and your focus will often end up getting diluted by all the different things you need to keep track of. So your focus tends to be more spread out. You'll often get tripped and slaughtered from not guarding yourself from incoming hits properly and failing to fight your best versus your opponent. Now understand, I'm not a shielding class. This perspective sounds like a fighter wrote it, but I'm actually a rogue, and this mindset works for any DPS class. Here are 16 more things that can give you an edge in fights. There are more things than this, of course. This is just what I thought of to mention today. Number 1 is reaction time. You ideally want to react fast to situations in PvP, assuming you can pull this off without being too impatient and botching your attacks. Being younger does help, but it also has a lot to do with how you feel and how well you use that to fuel your actions. Discipline and training can also help with getting used to reacting fast. Number 2 is cast speed. Powers with a fast cast speed can give you a big advantage. You can use fast cast speeds to hit your opponent mid-attack or mid-artifact cast. This is a bold strategy that often pays off, especially if your attacks apply control effects. You can also take advantage of fast cast speeds to attack really fast at the beginning of combat, hopefully killing your opponent before they even get a chance to hit you back. Number 3 is a good server and internet connection. This variable isn't something that everybody is able to control, but if you can, this is a major advantage. I recommend switching to a wired connection if you weren't using one already. So you want to be on a wired connection. Number 4 is how good at adapting you are and how well you think outside the box. If you are too predictable, you will lose more fights. Number 5 is high movement speed. Movement speed increases the distance your character travels when you jump while running. This helps you dive out of range of a melee class's follow-up attacks. It also can help you avoid ground effects and other attacks. It also helps you close the distance gap between you and your target, which is very useful for melee classes. Number 6 is paying attention to your opponent's stamina and conserving your own stamina. You can see your opponent's stamina bar, even if you couldn't, you can count count how many dodges they did within a short time span, or pay closer attention to how much damage it takes to punch through a shielding class's stamina. Now, as something to be aware of, the visible stamina bar you see on enemy players is sometimes inaccurate or delayed, so you don't want to be fully reliant on it. Number 7 is to space out your survival mechanics and only use them when you actually need them, so you don't waste them and are less likely to run out. Number 8 is counting the encounter attacks your opponent makes and always dodging 2 of them. This trick only works against some classes. It notably doesn't work that well against Ranger because they have 2 back-to-back rotations with a roughly 5-second downtime afterwards, and they're at will's hurt. Notably, Fighter will eventually kill squishy players even if they dodge almost every single attack the fighter makes. Number 9 is using your shield as a CC break, enemy combo sabotager. Shield mechanics in Mod 21 don't allow you to just turtle with your shield raised all the time. One big encounter hit will drain most of your stamina. So, you want to use your shield for the CC immunity and to sabotage enemy damage rotations. Sometimes you'll want to deliberately lower your shield and then raise it again partway through your opponent's damage rotation to block their most important attacks. This prevents them from draining your stamina preemptively and will probably sabotage their rotation. Number 10 is attack your opponent after their dodge ends in between their dodges. As a heads up, the immunity frame for some classes, such as Cleric and Rogue, lasts 1 or 2 seconds after their dodge animation ends. It takes practice to consistently get the timing right for hitting them. Assuming your opponent doesn't decide to double dodge, you can get a really high success rate for landing your attacks by doing this. This works better for some classes than others. Number 11 is intimidate and overwhelm your opponent to put them on the defensive. If your opponent is too busy defending themselves to attack you back, you will probably have the upper hand. Some of the common ways people accomplish this is by doing a lot of damage to their opponent or by interrupting them constantly with micro CCs. This is why I said earlier that you usually want to be very aggressive and confident when 1v1ing. If you don't feel this way, you can sometimes fake it. Try charging towards your opponent when you are vulnerable instead of running away. This is one of the many ways you can bluff inexperienced players. However, this trick doesn't always work, and it's usually a bad idea for frail, ranged paragons like Whisper Knife Rogue to attempt this. It's also really risky if your encounters are all on cooldown, but sometimes that risk pays off and saves your life. Number 12 is positioning. For positioning, you want your character to feel stable when you cast attacks, and you want to be in range. If you were standing too close to your target, did a glancing hit that just didn't connect well, dodged too soon or before or after you fired an attack, just got CC'd, etc., all of these things can result in your attack missing or doing a lot less damage than expected. Number 13 is knowledge of the class you are fighting. If you want to have a good grasp of when they are vulnerable and when they are dangerous. You also want to know what to use against them and when. A great example of this is when a barbarian activates Unstoppable at the same time that a rogue activates their stealth. This is a really smart thing for barbarians to do because it gives them the best possible chance of neutering the rogue when they are at their most dangerous. Number 14 is to try to do things you know your opponent really doesn't want you to do. As an example of this, don't allow your opponent to get away or have a break from your assault if you don't have to. Chase them when possible, especially if they're trying to retreat or heal to regain their cooldowns. If they are vulnerable when they do that, and if they want to get away from you, it is usually bad for you to let them have their wish. Similarly, you should try to punish your opponent for their mistakes when you see them make them. Another good example of this is when a player deliberately stands uncomfortably close to a ranged opponent. Number 15. Have a good understanding of what order you want to fire your powers in to get the most out of them. AKA, have a good understanding of what attack rotation to use in a given situation. Attack rotations can be very fluid and situational though, so you probably won't use the same rigid rotation every single time. Number 16. Having more or stronger crowd control than your opponent can also give you an edge over them. You often want to chain your CCs and keep your targets you often want to chain your CCs to keep your targets CC'd for longer. CCs have a myriad of other uses as well. As a build tip for making good 1 versus 1 builds, you want a trio of good defenses. Right now that is usually good self-healing, capped defense, and high HP. You want to be tanky usually if you are planning to 1 versus 1 a lot. You want to have the ability to continue your assault without having to back down much, and the ability to survive out in the open for long periods of time. You also generally want smoother and more reliable damage to make it easier to keep up the pressure on your opponent and put them on the defensive. In Mod 21, that often comes from high offense stats. To recap on the most important things I've discussed so far, here's a text block with my directions for how to maximize how much you improve, how much you and your opponent improve from 1 versus 1s. I will also read it for you. Fight the same person or class for a long period of time per session. I recommend spending at least an hour or two per session fighting the same person class over and over. And do these sessions with that person class multiple times. Even just 3 sessions spread out over 2 to 3 weeks can make a big difference. The reason why I recommend long duels like this is so you actually improve, and so RNG bullshit like crits who had their daily ready, etc. doesn't skew your dueling results. Don't burn yourself out, don't overdo it. But do make sure you stick around long enough to get don't burn yourself out, don't overdo it, but do make sure you stick around long enough to get a big enough sample size. You both want to fight each other long enough to have warmed up, gotten used to each other, and readjusted to each other several times. On a closing note, here is another text block that goes over some basic etiquette guidelines for 1 versus 1s. This is just what I suggest. It's not a rule. Basic 1 versus 1 etiquette. Both participants should type R in the chat or say ready over voice chat before starting the duel. Wait for your opponent to regenerate to full HP before starting another duel. Usually you also want them to have full stamina too. Likewise, don't say you are ready until your HP is full. An exception would be respawn timer duels where you are fighting to cap and control the node longer than your opponent. Don't fire AP generating stuff between duels unless both of you are doing it. Discuss rules for what items are allowed beforehand. Most private 1 versus 1s don't use 3k damage dealing mounts or rejuvenating favor. Note that duels usually don't wait on PvP healing potions to come back, so be smart and don't spend your healing potion in between duels. I recommend you both use your stat, HP, and damage increasing potions for most accurate results. If this is too expensive, at least make sure neither one of you are using potions. Some classes are really strong if you give them free map rain, but are weaker if they are forced to fight on node or in a small area. Some classes have to be permitted to flee and hide some in order to function in a 1 versus 1. But you don't want to go too far with it. That's all for now, guys. See you next time. As a reminder, I will link the script for this video in the video description for people looking to verify what their ears heard.